John sat on his porch like he did every evening, the wheels of his chair slightly angled toward the old oak tree that marked the edge of his property. The breeze carried the scent of pine, and the faint hum of cicadas filled the air, but none of it stirred anything in him, not anymore. His days were quiet, predictable, sometimes painfully so. Ever since the explosion in Kandahar took the use of his legs, John had gotten used to a world that moved on without him. He watched the sun dip lower behind the trees, painting the sky in soft streaks of orange and pink, and he let his mind drift as it always did to memories of sand and smoke and brothers he would never see again. And just as he began to slip into that familiar haze of thought, a sound reached his ears, sharp and sudden and entirely out of place. At first he thought it was the wind, maybe a bird, something small and fleeting. But it came again, longer this time and unmistakably alive, a whimper, a cry from the woods behind his house. It was faint, but filled with something raw, like pain or fear or both, and it struck John like a jolt. He leaned forward in his chair, trying to isolate the sound through the rustling leaves and the buzzing summer air, and again it came, a howl, low and aching, stretching into the dusk like a question with no answer, and John's heart began to race in a way it had not for years. He gripped the armrests of his chair and wheeled himself closer to the edge of the porch, peering into the woods. The sound had changed now. It was closer, or maybe clearer, and it did not sound wild. It sounded like a dog in trouble, not the bark of aggression, but the cry of something hurt, maybe trapped, and something inside John refused to ignore it. He glanced toward the house next door, where Marcus, the teenage neighbor, often sat with headphones and a game controller, and shouted his name with a force that surprised even himself. Within seconds, Marcus appeared, eyes wide and unsure, as John pointed toward the woods and told him what he had heard. Marcus hesitated only for a moment, then nodded and disappeared back into his house, emerging with a flashlight and a heavy jacket, and the two of them set off into the trees. The path, narrow and barely lit the wheels of John's chair, catching on roots and rocks as Marcus pushed from behind without a word. They moved like this in silence, broken only by the occasional bark or yelp ahead of them, and the sounds grew louder, more desperate, until they stumbled into a small clearing and stopped cold. There, in the fading light, barely visible against the undergrowth, was a large German shepherd chained to a crooked tree, its body thin and shaking, its eyes wide with terror and recognition, as if it had been waiting for anyone to come. John stared at the dog for a long moment, unable to move, not from the chair, not from the spot, not from the weight pressing into his chest, because there was something in the eyes of that German shepherd, something haunted and familiar, as if it had seen things no living creature should see and survived it anyway, barely. The dog did not growl, it did not bark, it simply stared back, and then let out a sound that stopped the air around them, a low broken whine that spoke of hunger and fear and weeks of solitude, chained alone in the middle of nowhere, with no promise of rescue until now. Marcus stepped forward slowly, arms raised, his voice low and careful, like he was speaking to something feral but sacred, and John could see the chain now tight around the dog's neck, rusty and cutting into the fur, and even from a distance he could see the animal was injured, one paw swollen and blistered, the fur on its back patchy and stained with old dried blood. John told Marcus to stop, not out of fear, but out of instinct, because he could see that the dog was at the edge, not just physically but mentally, and any sudden movement could tip it over into something dangerous, something final. But then something happened. The dog turned its head away from Marcus and looked directly at John, its eyes softening, its body trembling, but not from fear this time, from something else, something like hope, and with a weak whimper, it took a single step forward, dragging the chain through the dirt, then another step, and another, until it collapsed at the foot of John's wheelchair, head resting against the metal frame, tail twitching just slightly like it remembered how to trust. John leaned down as far as he could and reached out, fingers brushing against the matted fur, and the dog made no move to bite or pull away. Instead, it let out a sigh, long and low and heartbreaking, like it had been holding its breath for weeks, and finally someone had given it permission to exhale. Marcus looked at John, eyes wide, mouth open like he could not believe what he was seeing, but John said nothing because he too was in disbelief, not at the dog but at himself, at the stirring in his chest, at the way this broken animal had chosen him out of all people as the one to rest its head upon, as the one to trust. They needed help, that much was clear, so Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed the local animal control. While John stayed there, his hand still on the dog's head, whispering words. He didn't even know he remembered words he used to say to wounded soldiers in the field: "Stay with me, hold on, you are not alone now." And the dog, eyes closed, chest rising and falling, slow and shallow, stayed right there, not moving, not flinching, as the sun finally disappeared behind the trees and the world around them grew dark and quiet once more. By the time the first flashlight beam appeared through the trees, John had lost all sense of time. He had not moved from the clearing, not taken his hand off the dog's head, not spoken except in quiet murmurs that only the two of them could understand. Marcus waved down the animal control officers, his voice urgent, explaining what they had found and how long the dog might have been out here, and the officers moved in slow and careful, trying not to startle the animal. But it did not react, it did not bark or run or resist, it just stayed close to John, as if drawn by something it could not explain. The officers knelt beside it, examined the chain, the wounds, the swollen paw, and the deep cuts around its neck, and they exchanged looks that made John's stomach turn. One of them pulled out a small scanner and ran it over the dog's back, and there was a beep and then silence as the man looked down at the small screen and frowned. He said there was a chip and that it was registered to a name, a place, a case that had gone cold months ago, and he asked John and Marcus to step back while they took photos of the chain, of the clearing, of the cage they found hidden in the brush nearby, rusted and broken with dried blood along the hinges and a collar still locked inside. They were not just looking at a lost dog anymore, they were looking at evidence, and it hit John like a punch to the gut that this dog had not just been abandoned, it had been left behind after something terrible, something cruel and intentional, and whoever did it had never expected the dog to survive. The officer told them in a low voice that the dog had likely escaped a fighting ring, maybe crawled through the woods after being dumped or left for dead, and that it was lucky it had not died from infection or starvation or exposure. And John looked down at the animal, still lying at his feet, and felt a deep rising anger he had not felt in years. He asked if the dog would be taken to a shelter, and the officer nodded, said it would be brought in for medical care, that there would be an investigation. But John saw the look in the man's eyes, a look that said the dog's chances were slim, not because it was dangerous, but because no one wanted broken things, no one wanted to take the time to heal what someone else had tried to destroy. John looked back at the dog, its breathing shallow, its ears twitching, and he knew he could not let it go, not like that, not into a system that saw it as a number, a burden, a case to be filed and forgotten. And he told the officer flatly that he would take it, that he would sign whatever he had to sign, that he had room in his house and in his life, and that he knew what it meant to be left behind and still want to live. The officer hesitated, but something in John's voice, something solid and unwavering, seemed to convince him, and he nodded slowly, said it might be possible after the medical exam. And John leaned back in his chair, his hand still resting on the dog's battered head, and he felt a shift inside himself, like something long buried was beginning to stir. Marcus stood beside him, silent, respectful, not saying a word, because he too understood what was happening here. He saw it in John's face and in the way the dog lifted its eyes, just enough to meet John's gaze again, as if to say thank you without a sound. And in that quiet space under the stars, with the woods pressing in and the air heavy with things unsaid, something unspoken passed between man and animal, a promise forged not in words but in survival. The van from animal control drove slowly down the winding path away from the woods and into town, its red lights casting flickers through the trees, and John sat in silence. Long after it was gone, the scent of soil and rust still in the air. Marcus offered to push him back home, but John waved him off. He wanted a moment alone to let everything settle, because something had cracked open inside him and he was not ready to let it close again. Later that night, John sat by the window watching the empty street, his mind restless, and his body still aching from the rough trail through the woods. The image of the dog, chained and silent, haunted him every time he blinked, and he could still feel its head resting against his leg, like it belonged there, like it had been waiting its whole life to find someone who understood without needing to speak. He barely slept, and when morning came, he was already by the phone calling the shelter, asking for updates, asking for the dog. The officer had called the animal Valor, which John found fitting in a way that made his throat tighten. The woman on the phone said Valor had survived the night, that he was sedated for pain and being treated for infections and broken teeth, and that he was very underweight but responsive and calm, especially around staff, which was not always the case with dogs rescued from fights. She paused before adding that many of the dogs from these situations had to be evaluated to see if they were safe to rehome, and John heard what she was saying between the words, a polite warning that if Bala failed their tests or reacted badly, he might not be given a second chance. And John felt that same old fire rise in his chest, the one that used to burn in him during missions when things went wrong and someone had to step up. He told her to put his name down to notify him of any decisions, and that he would come down every day if needed to prove he was serious. And the woman said softly that she could hear it in his voice that he meant it, and he thanked her, then hung up and sat for a long time in silence, his fingers drumming against the wheels of his chair, the house around him feeling less like a tomb than it had in years. Over the next few days, John became a regular at the shelter, arriving early, waiting by the observation window, watching Valor rest and heal, and sometimes just sitting there for hours reading aloud from old books, or just talking about nothing and everything, as if the dog could hear every word, and in some strange way John believed he could. The staff began to notice something, that Valor seemed calmer when John was around, that he would lift his head or wag his tail, even if just a little, when he heard John's voice, and one of the younger techs even said it was the first time she had ever seen one of the fight dogs respond like that to someone so quickly. They ran their evaluations, slowly testing Valor's responses, his triggers, his behavior with food and touch and loud noises, and each time John held his breath until the reports came back saying that Valor passed, that he was scared but not aggressive, wary but not violent, and that there was something in him worth saving. Finally, the day came when they brought him into a quiet room and let John come in alone, and as soon as he crossed the threshold, Valor stood shakily, his legs still unsure, his eyes bright and full of that same spark. And when John wheeled forward and reached out, Valor walked the last few steps and placed his head in John's lap like it was the only place in the world he was ever meant to be. The papers were signed before the end of the week, and John brought Valor home in the back of Marcus's truck with blankets folded carefully and a soft harness fitted snug around the dog's keeling frame. The drive was quiet except for the occasional rustle as Valor shifted and sniffed the air, and John kept one hand resting near him, offering quiet reassurance without needing to say a word, because they both understood what this meant. It was not just adoption, it was redemption. When they pulled into the driveway, Valor lifted his head and looked around with eyes that seemed to scan for danger or disappointment, but John only smiled and told him softly, "This is home now, this is safe." And the dog seemed to understand, because he stepped out slowly, his body low to the ground, but his nose working overtime and his ears twitching at every sound. Inside the house, John had prepared a space in the living room, a thick dog bed near the fireplace, bowls of water and soft food within easy reach, and a basket of toys that Marcus had picked out himself. And Valor sniffed it all with quiet curiosity, then settled onto the bed with a long sigh, as if letting go of something heavy he had been carrying for far too long. The first few days were careful ones, measured in small victories. Valor would eat if John was nearby, would sleep deeper if he could hear John's breathing, would follow him from room to room with tentative steps, like a shadow learning how to live in the light again. And John never rushed him, never pushed. He knew too well what it meant to live in a body and a mind that no longer trusted the world. Neighbors began to notice John outside, more often, sometimes just sitting on the porch with Valor beside him, both of them staring at the trees, sometimes walking slowly down the sidewalk with Marcus holding the leash and John telling stories from another life, one filled with deserts and dust and brothers who never made it home, and always Valor listened, his ears perked, his eyes calm, as if he were carrying those memories too. One afternoon, a reporter came by from the local paper, said they had heard about the rescue, said it was a good story, and John hesitated but agreed and sat with Valor on the porch as the camera clicked. And the questions came, and he told the story in simple words, nothing dramatic, just the truth about a cry in the woods, a chain, and a second chance. And by the end of it, the reporter's voice had softened, and she scratched behind Valor's ears like he was an old friend. The article ran 2 days later with the headline Wounded Warrior and Rescued Fighter Heal Together, and something about it sparked attention online. People shared it, commented, sent letters and food, and even donations to the shelter. And suddenly, John was being asked to speak at veteran centers and schools to bring valor and tell their story. At first, he said no, unsure if he could stand before crowds again, even from a chair, but Marcus pushed him gently, reminded him that maybe someone out there needed to hear it, needed to know that broken was not the same as useless, and that sometimes scars were the only proof we survived. So John agreed, and Valor came with him, always calm, always by his side, and each time he told the story, it hurt a little less and healed a little more, and the applause never mattered, but the silence did. The way people leaned in and listened, really listened, and afterward the way they reached out, not just to him but to each other. Because the truth was simple and powerful and impossible to ignore. Two souls left behind had found each other in the dark and brought each other home. It was raining the first time John took Valor to a veterans center, the kind of cold, steady rain that soaked into your bones and made everything feel heavier. But John felt calm as they rolled through the wide glass doors, Valor walking steady at his side, his steps slow but sure, the harness snug against his chest, and his ears flicking every few seconds like radar scanning for something that never came. The staff greeted them warmly. The director, a woman named Carla, shook John's hand and knelt to greet Valor, who stood still and alert, but allowed her to stroke his ears, and when she looked up her eyes were already glassy. She had read the article, she said, and watched the interview, and now seeing them both here in front of her, she felt something real, something good, something rare. The room was full of faces, some young, some old, some scared on the outside, some on the inside, and as John moved to the front, Valor settled beside him without command, head high, tail still, eyes focused, like he understood this was not just another visit, this was a mission. John began to speak, not with grand speeches or rehearsed lines, just words simple and honest about what it meant to feel left behind, to come home to silence, to lose parts of yourself and be expected to carry on like nothing changed. He spoke about nights that felt endless and days that felt empty, and about the moment he heard a cry in the woods and everything began to shift. He talked about Valor, about the chain and the cage, and the way the dog had looked at him, not with fear but with something deeper like recognition. And the room stayed quiet, so quiet you could hear the rain tapping softly against the windows, and when John's voice wavered, nobody turned away. Afterward, people came up slowly, some with canes, some in wheelchairs, some with hands that trembled from nerves or memory, and they all wanted to meet the dog who had survived. They crouched beside Valor, speaking softly, petting him like he was sacred, and in many ways he was, not just for what he endured, but for what he inspired. From that day on, the center asked John and Valor to return, not once, not twice, but every week, to sit in the circle, to share space with those who needed it, to be a reminder that healing was possible even if it came in pieces. And John always said yes, not because he had all the answers, but because he knew what it meant to have none and still get up anyway. The shelter where Valor had stayed began a new program in his name, a project to rehabilitate dogs from fight rings and pair them with veterans struggling with PTSD, and John helped design it, volunteered every month, bringing supplies and sharing his story, and sometimes just sitting with new arrivals, reading to them the same way he had read to Valor during those first long quiet days. People began writing from other states, asking how they could help, how they could start something similar, and for the first time in years, John felt like his life was moving forward, not in spite of the past, but because everything he had lived through had led him to that cry in the woods, that chain in the dirt, that heartbeat pressed against his still legs. One evening after a long visit to the center, John wheeled out to the porch with Valor at his feet, the sun dipping low behind the trees, and for a long time he said nothing, just listened to the birds, the breeze, the distant sound of children playing, and he thought of how far they had come. And beside him, Valor lifted his head, looked out at the same view, and then leaned against John, not for comfort, but for company, because sometimes healing does not come in noise or applause or answers. Sometimes it comes in the quiet presence of someone who stayed. Weeks passed, and the seasons began to change, turning the trees from green to gold and red, and John found himself adjusting to a new rhythm, one that involved not just Valor, but the community around them as well, friends who came by to visit, and people who stopped him on the street to ask how Valor was doing. And though John never liked the attention, he learned to accept it as part of the new life he was building. Every day felt like a reminder that healing was not linear, that some days were easier than others, that there would be moments of quiet joy and moments where the weight of everything past would press down hard, but it was easier now to breathe in those moments and wait for the next one to come. Marcus continued to be by his side, taking John to places he hadn't gone in years, and sometimes just sitting with him in the backyard with Valor at their feet, watching the world around them and talking about things that seemed so small in the grand scheme, but were the things that mattered most, those little victories, those moments of peace that John had thought would never come again. One afternoon, when the wind was sharp and the clouds had gathered thick above the town, John and Marcus went for a walk down the old dirt road that led out toward the lake. Valor walked beside them, his tail wagging slowly with each step, his pace steady and calm, as if he knew where he was going, or maybe he simply knew that with John beside him the path would always lead them home. John felt something new in himself as they walked, something unfamiliar but welcome, a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to the past but to the present, to this new bond that had formed between them, something that no longer felt like survival alone but like living in the moment, something worth fighting for again. As they neared the lake, John paused and looked out over the water, watching the ripples spread in the distance. He hadn't realized how much he had missed being outside in the world until now, how much he had missed feeling connected to something greater than himself, and he took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cool air. Valor stopped beside him, looking out over the same view, and for a moment it was as if they were both seeing the same thing at once, not just the water, not just the trees, but the lives they had left behind, and the new lives they were building together. Marcus stood a few paces away, looking at them both with a smile that spoke more than words ever could, and for a long time no one said anything, no one needed to, because in that silence something passed between them, an understanding that no words could capture, no story could tell, just the quiet presence of two souls who had been lost and found in each other. The next morning the call came from the shelter, and John sat up straighter when he heard the voice on the other end telling him that there was a new dog ready for adoption, one that had been rescued just like Valor, only this one had a history of aggression, a history that would take time to undo. And though it was clear that this dog would need special care and patience, the shelter wanted to know if John was interested. He looked over at Valor, who was curled up on the couch beside him, his head resting on his paws, and for a moment John didn't answer, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he already knew the answer before the question was even asked. "Yes," he said softly, "yes, I'm interested," and he knew that with Valor by his side, whatever came next would be just another part of the journey they were on together, another chance to save another soul, just like his had been saved. A few days later, John found himself sitting in a small room at the shelter with the new dog beside him, a pit bull mix with deep brown eyes and a body that seemed too big for its own skin. The dog was thin but strong, its muscles rippling under its coat, and when it looked up at John, there was fear there, a wariness that only came from a life filled with loss and violence. The shelter staff had warned him that this one might not be as easy as Bella had been, that it would take time and patience to get through the barriers that had been built so deeply into this dog's mind, and though John knew the road ahead might be long, he also knew that he had been down roads just as difficult before and had made it to the other side. Wallace sat beside him, his body relaxed, but his eyes alert, watching the new dog with interest, as if he too understood that this was part of their shared purpose, part of the work that had been set in front of them. And as the pit bull mix sniffed the air and cautiously approached Valor, it was clear that there was something in that quiet meeting, something that spoke of understanding, not just between the humans, but between the animals as well. For the next few weeks, John kept a careful watch over the new dog. He spent hours each day sitting on the floor with it, speaking softly and gently guiding it through the smallest moments of trust. Each time the dog would hesitate, John would wait patiently, letting it come to him when it was ready, and Valor remained by his side, always present, always calm, always offering something that words could never express. As the days passed, the new dog began to show signs of improvement. It would sit beside John without pulling away, would let him stroke its fur without flinching, and every once in a while there would be a moment when it would look up at him with those same eyes that Valor had looked at him with so many months ago, and in that moment John knew that this dog too was learning how to live again. The shelter staff marveled at how quickly the dog had settled in, how much progress had been made in such a short time, and they often remarked on how much Valor seemed to be teaching the dog without saying a word, as if he was showing it how to trust, how to forgive, and how to be whole again. One evening, as John sat outside with Valor and the new dog watching the sun set behind the trees, he felt a sense of peace that he had never known before. It was the kind of peace that came from knowing that even after everything that had happened, even after the darkness and the pain, there was always the possibility of light. There was always the chance for redemption. Valor lay beside him, his head resting on John's lap, as the new dog paced in small circles nearby, still unsure, but slowly learning that it was safe, that it was okay to let go of the past and just be. As the last light of the day faded into the night, John sat quietly, taking in the moment, the stillness of the evening and the warmth of the two dogs beside him, and for the first time in a long while he didn't feel like something was missing. He didn't feel incomplete, because he had come to realize that sometimes healing didn't mean returning to the way things were. Sometimes it meant finding a new way forward, a way that could include both the broken and the whole, and that together they could make something better, something stronger, something worth holding on to. He looked at the two dogs and smiled softly, because they had come together in a way that only the wounded could understand, and they had healed each other in ways that went beyond what anyone could have expected. And for the first time in a long time, John believed that maybe, just maybe, he had found the place where he truly belonged.